All rise. All rise.
Greetings. I would like to welcome everyone to the second day of this International Tribunal. We still charge genocide, and I'm just so very honored that our international panelists of jurists are here to hear these days of testimony. What you have just heard was music from Brother Veronza Bowers. Veronza, who has been incarcerated for over 47 years. Veronza, who should have been released over 6 to 8 years ago. We're talking about someone who is a very gifted instrumentalist. And his feature is this very, very special flute called the shakuhachi. I might not have it pronounced correctly, but what you were just listening to is that with overlaid ocean sounds. And it's just a remembrance to us that we have people who have been behind bars, who are extremely gifted, who are extremely talented. And what would they be doing if they were here on the outside? Such talent just going to waste. So I just wanted to make sure that we here in the room, as well as in the Zoom, had the opportunity to hear just a bit from one of our political prisoners of war. So at this time, we're about to go into count 4 of the indictment. Count one dealt with police killings and violence. Count 2 dealt with mass incarceration. Count 3 dealt with political prisoners and prisoners of war. And now count 4, we are about to start environmental racism. And we want to bring into the Zoom room live testimony on Zoom from our dear sister, Rukia Lumumba, who is the executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute of Mississippi. Rukia Lumumba, who is the sister of the current mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Anta Lumumba, and Rukia Lumumba, who is the daughter of my legal mentor, Brother Chokwe Lumumba, who is now in Ancestor. And her examination will be directed by Howard University Law School student Valencia R. So let's go on and begin the Zoom. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Valencia R.A., and I'm a student attorney in Howard University School of Law's Movement More in Flint. Can you state your name, where you live, and what qualifies you to testify
Rukia,
today?
if you can hear me, I understand your audio may not be connected, but I see you now, so maybe your audio is connected. And Valencia, if you can repeat the question you just asked, but before you do, Rukia Lumumba, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so continue. Thank you.
Can you state your name, where you live, and what qualifies you to testify today?
Yes. So one, I just want to thank the tribunal for providing me with the opportunity to address the tribunal today to testify. I am Rukia Lumumba. I am the founding director of the People's Advocacy Institute. We also call it PAI. The People's Advocacy Institute is a resource and training incubator for transformative justice in the South. We, by engaging communities in electoral justice efforts, people's assemblies, alternatives to incarceration initiatives, and an intentional grassroots process for cultivating ideas and developing solutions, we build community capacity, inspire self-determination, and community-driven solutions to systemic violence, punitive legal systems, and social injustice facing far too many of our communities. But I'm not only testifying today on behalf of PAI, I'm also Testifying as a member of the Movement for Black Lives, an ecosystem of individuals and organizations creating a shared vision and policy agenda to win rights, recognition, and resources for Black people. I'm also here on behalf of the Mississippi Rapid Response Coalition, a collective of over 40 organizations and individuals formed out of the frequent climate crisis occurring in Mississippi and impacting primarily Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. The coalition is dedicated to building community-led rapid response infrastructure for the care, well-being, and safety of people and communities most vulnerable to climate disasters. Finally, I am here today to testify as a representative of the Southern Power Fund, a community fund of Southern movement organizations that have come together to move much needed resources to Southern frontline communities responding and resisting during this current and critical political moment. My testimony comes not only from my years of working with communities, most impacted by willful and intentional government neglect, but also comes from my direct experience as a Black woman reared in Jackson, Mississippi, land of the Natchez and Choctaw people in the heart of the Deep South, a place where white invaders massacred an entire nation of people once known as the Natchez, a place that replaced Indigenous labor with forced African labor in the most inhumane conditions one can imagine, a place that has a staunch history of Black resistance to white violence, a place that birthed, let me say that again, birthed the voting rights movement of 1965 under the leadership of the amazing Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar Evers, hundreds of brave Black Mississippians who literally sacrificed their bodies for the right to democracy. A place that has more Black elected officials than any other state within America. Yet and still, it is a place that is still under white supremacist state leadership, has the worst economic outcomes, severely crumbling infrastructure, and unattainable healthcare. Despite these barriers, we, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor Mississippians have consistently saved ourselves, creating some of the first community land trusts, cooperatives, and other collective leadership models that allow for our safety and well-being. Today, we continue in that tradition of our ancestors that maintain their commitment to the land, our self-determined right to govern the land collectively, and the human right of all people to live in environmentally safe conditions. So this is who I am, and this is why I am qualified to testify today. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell me about your experience regarding environmental injustices in Mississippi and throughout the southern region of the United States?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I think a few people will probably testify to some of the more major disasters that we have seen in terms of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, where we saw the federal government completely neglect and willfully allow folks to die. For 3 days, left people in floodwaters with snakes and alligators and every creature you could imagine, left without food, in heat, dying heat, over 100 degrees heat. That happened not only in New Orleans, but we saw that impact in Mississippi that was also hit, as well as Alabama, which is the Gulf Coast. That was my first direct experience of seeing a climate disaster in which the government willfully neglected to take care of our people. And instead, we as community members began that process of figuring out, once again, how to save ourselves. And so we saw it in Katrina. But then we saw it again most recently in 2019, at the end of 2019, December 2019, moving all the way up to the beginning of 2020. So February of 2020, and then moving forward, where in Mississippi, people incarcerated in prisons, including the notorious Parchman Penitentiary, which is an 18,000 acre former plantation turned prison after Reconstruction, where people who were incarcerated initiated an uprising demanding humane living conditions. The uprising started because incarcerated people, men, women, youth, gender nonconforming people were forced to live in small cages with raw sewage and human feces, no running water, and 24-hour lockdown. Men were forced to sleep, eat, and breathe in these toxic conditions. And these conditions didn't appear overnight, or a result of consistent neglect by the state to provide even the most basic environmentally safe conditions for over 19,000 people that they currently incarcerate in Mississippi prisons. And then in 2021, just this year, at the beginning of the year, we saw the state fail yet again to respond to keeping our communities safe. After 3 weeks without running water in 19 cities, including the capital city of Jackson, Mississippi, where over 50,000 residents were without water, after what we experienced, what people are calling an Arctic blast, leaving our pipes busted, over 130 pipes busted throughout the city, leaving thousands of residents without heat during the coldest time we have ever experienced in our lives. For those of you who don't know Mississippi, Mississippi is in a warmer climate. Most people in Mississippi don't even own a coat. We normally wear 2 sweaters when it gets cold, right? Because it doesn't get cold enough to even wear a coat most of the year. And so for us to have sheets of ice and snow with ice underneath, no salt, not enough salt to provide for the street clearings. People were stuck in their house. People were without water, without heat, pipes busted, and the state failed to call for a federal emergency, for a state emergency. They didn't fail 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. They literally failed. The governor failed to call for a state of emergency after 3 weeks. And instead of waiting on the state, what we did as Black and Indigenous and community members, immigrant-based community members, we got out on the streets. Those of us who had 4-wheel trucks that could actually go to homes where elders we knew were cold without heat, and get them heat by buying kerosene, driving miles and miles to get it, or having people come into the city to provide it to us. We began to develop this coalition that I talked about earlier called the Mississippi Response Coalition, Rapid Response Coalition, which hit every area in which Mississippians were without water, without heat, and without food due to that crisis. After the 3 weeks, when the governor finally brought in trucks to help bring potable water so people could just flush their toilets, water so that we could actually begin to see some change in our city. What we then saw is that it took another 2 more weeks before water was even restored to the city, capital city of Jackson. And many rural communities were still suffering as well. And so this neglect was not a neglect that came overnight. Just like in the prisons, it was a neglect that was intentional. It was a neglect that was based on the state's divestment from Black-led communities, Black-led cities, and cities that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, or poor. We know this because we have seen the trajectory and seen what happens in other cities that don't have that same demographic. We've seen infrastructure repair in other cities that have a more white population, but we see what happens when Black leadership takes over. The state withdraws. And so that is some of what we've been seeing in Jackson. I can talk more even about the most recent hurricane that we experienced that also left people without water, but I can answer any additional questions.
Yes, I want to talk a bit more about the water crisis in Jackson, but I also want to talk about the people that live there. Can you tell me a bit about the demographics of that area?
Yeah. So Jackson, Mississippi is the capital city, as I've stated before. It is over 88% Black. The numbers range between 85% and 88% at any given time, a Black city. It has a growing immigrant population of primarily Indigenous folks from Central America. We have also known as, Hispanic or Latinx folks. It is also a place with a significant Vietnamese community, as well as Southeast Asian and small West and East African community. Jackson is by far the largest city by 3 times in the state of Mississippi. And it has been under Black leadership only for the past about 4 decades, which is about not 4 decades, sorry, about 30 years. And it is a place that has unfortunately, a tax base that has been deprived of economic opportunity, has been deprived by the state of job resources. We have seen literally businesses moved out of Jackson purposefully and placed into the surrounding predominantly white suburbs as an attack on the city to begin to starve it of economic gain and to make our tax base poorer and poorer. We have about 24% of residents of Jackson are living below the poverty line. A livable wage in Mississippi does not exist. We still have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Jackson is in this state and therefore is still subject to those laws and rules. Because we have responsible leadership, we have seen an increase in city employees' pay. We have seen a desire and a push by our city leaders, especially our mayor, to actually push for a livable wage of $15 an hour and for resources to have that. I want to just jump back a little bit to the demographics of the water. Because Jackson is a predominantly Black city, that means our water infrastructure problems impact a predominantly Black base, right? And so I believe there is correlation there around why there has been such a significant divestment from Jackson and a failure of the state until this year, a failure of the state to actually even provide resources to Jackson to fix its infrastructure problems that have existed for literally over 100 years before it ever entered into Black leadership. Our water infrastructure problem is an over $1 billion issue. And it predated any Black leadership. And it is one that the state is absolutely responsible for. And this year was the first year that the state, because of the national attention that we received, probably from many of you all in who are listening today, what we saw was the state was forced to move money to Jackson to actually immediately repair some of the broken pipes so that folks could have running water. Without that national attention, we still wouldn't have got the little bit of money that they sent, which was around 26 million to fix an over $1 billion problem. Not only is the state responsible for that, but the state, and especially the governor and the lieutenant governor, has repeatedly made attacks against Jackson, saying that its water infrastructure problem is a result of poor leadership. Our water infrastructure problem is not a result of poor leadership. It is a result of intentional and willful neglect and intentional divestment from our city and from our repairs of what needs to happen in our piping and sewage lines. And that is, to me, one of the most egregious ways that we see anti-Black racism rearing its head. And so I'll stop there.
So in a predominantly Black city such as Jackson, with a water crisis making water safe to drink and hard to come by, what impact would you say that has on Black people, especially those that live near or below the poverty line?
You know, it has the same effect that you would think it would have on anybody, right? You know, we need water to survive. We need drinkable water. As a person who was there for the 5 weeks and two didn't have water, right? You don't realize how much you need water until you don't have it. You don't not realize what a privilege it is to be able to flush your toilet, to be able to take a shower, to be able to drink, just literally drink a glass or take a sip of water and not have to ration it throughout the day because you don't know when you're going to get your next sip. You know, we would enter homes because we were delivering water consistently to folks. When we were finally able to get the roads cleared and trucks were able to get in to provide us with bottled water and boxed water, we began to distribute them to homes, to house, deliver them straight to house to house to house. And we would go into some elder's home and you would see the several pots lined up where they had been boiling the water once the electricity came back on, so that they could actually have boiling the bottled water just so that they could take showers and do things like that. When some residents' water began to trickle in, they began to use that to boil as well in order to take showers and at least brush your teeth and do very minimal things. I mean, for weeks, businesses were shut down. It's a Black city and a lot of Black business. Businesses were shut down for weeks. The economic cost of those businesses were great. The economic hardship that it caused the city was beyond what anyone would imagine until you've experienced it. Schools were shut down, so children were forced to stay home. Parents were forced not to go to work. You had situations where people who need water in order for their medical needs to be met, people on dialysis, people who were taking insulin and all of the various different medical things that you wouldn't even connect water to, but is necessary to actually perform the medical need. So many people just in bad situations, it's extremely bad, dire situations. So it caused us great hardship, definitely impacted our well-being. And that impacts your mental health as well, physical well-being, but also our mental.
Earlier, you mentioned that you were helping to volunteer and pass out water to people in need. How do you feel people would be affected if people like you weren't out volunteering, especially with the state's response?
I can tell you right now that a lot of people would have died. It's not a question. A number of people would have died.
Can they hear me?
And our coalition had over 40 organizations that participated, where we provided them resources to get food, water, heat to people. Because remember, the water was a part of it, but in the beginning, people didn't have heat either, right? And so you have that combined, and you have, Jackson is also a place with a growing, it's an aging community, meaning that we have a significant number of elders that live in this city. And these folks, and we have folks that are in desperate need of just medical care and treatment and ongoing support in that way. So without water, and for small periods of time without heat, and not small periods, because when you're without heat for 2 weeks, that's not a small period of time, right?
Let me interrupt for just one moment, Rukia. I'm sorry. We have a question from the Chief Judge, and one of the jurors as well. And the question is going to be via phone because she's not live here in the room. Do you want to?
Okay, go ahead now.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for being present. I think this is a huge commitment from everybody's side of participation, the witnesses and everybody else present. My question that I want to put to Rukia Lumumba is around the issue of the 3 decades of leadership. I'm from South Africa, and we are almost into 3 decades of democracy. And we find the same conditions in respect of environmental racism to a degree, and racism in general. But my real question is, what are the conditions of the remaining 12% of the population of Jackson, Mississippi? Are they white, and what is their economic and environmental situation? Thank you very much, Chief Advisor. Thank you to everybody else present.
Thank you so much. That is a great question. And oftentimes when I talk about Jackson, I do compare it to conditions of our comrades in South Africa. We share a lot of similarities. And I had time to, in the late 90s, to study over at the University of Fort Hare, and those stark parallels were just, I felt like I was at home literally until people started talking, right? And we had different accents. So when we talk about the 12%, I want to make it clear that Mississippi leadership, state leadership all over, is willfully neglectful around environmental justice, period, right? They care about profit over people. So in terms of whether the state has been responsible anywhere for the actual improvement of conditions of a city, we have yet to see. Normally, where there is predominantly a white population, they have the economic resources to fix the problem themselves. The state still isn't coming in to do exactly what is needed. However, the state will support them by putting businesses, by supporting and providing them tax relief, by doing other things that allow them to continue to build the wealth that they're experiencing in their communities, while depriving that from Black communities. And so what we see in Jackson is that majority of the people, one, that are in Jackson, white people that are in Jackson, have chosen to stay in Jackson primarily either as a political stance or have stayed in Jackson because they got property they don't want to let go, and they don't want to be out in the rural community having to drive everywhere and not be able to be closer to resources. And so in predominantly white communities, which there are not that many, it's mainly wealthy communities. It's mainly wealthy white communities that have existed for many years, and they are closer to what we consider the water infrastructure base. So our water comes from what is called a reservoir. And that reservoir, years ago when the city was developed, years and years, decades ago when the city was developed, the communities that were the water-based communities that were closer to the water base weren't developed yet. And so when that water base was developed, communities began to pop up closer to that water base because they had easier access to that water. And those have historically primarily been white, wealthier communities, white, wealthier people who have the access to purchase that land. And so as you move further and further away from the water base, you see the access to water dwindle. So for example, in South Jackson, which is historically a Black or poor white community, they have some of the worst water issues because they are furthest away from the water base and have historically been that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and we have one more question from another jurist, and then I'll let you proceed with the testimony.
But the bottom line is, I wanted to say, the bottom line is that the state must give money to fix the infrastructure problem, period, in general.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Rukia Lumumba. This is my fellow jurist and I had a question regarding the striking information you shared about the length of time that there were broken pipes when you spoke about that climate disaster and just benign neglect. You also alluded to some patterns from other urban centers, which are also the population is Black, brown, and perhaps Indigenous people. So we're wondering if there are any lead or other contamination impacts that may have resulted from this as well. Thank you.
Well, one of the good things about having responsible Black leadership that actually is rooted in community, which we haven't already always had, but we have it now, is that they take they recognize the importance of water standards. And so what we don't have a huge lead problem because we're always under boil water notice. So we do have a problem. Let me restate that. We have a problem with possible lead contamination. We have a problem with contamination of our water from other substances, elements, every time there is a climate disaster because our pipes are so bad, right? And so things can get into the water supply easily. They burst or things like that. So every time we have a major crisis of water contamination, what we see or pipes bursting is that we'll go immediately under a boil water alert. So that one, it's time to test the water, see what's going on, or we'll be told not to drink the water at all, right? So most households in Jackson we don't drink tap water. We haven't drank tap water. I can't tell you a time when I drank tap water in Jackson without a filter. Since I grew up in Jackson, and I can't tell you a time that I drank tap water, even as a child. So most residents are relying on either a filter or bottled water because of the possibility of lead contamination and contamination based on other elements, due to piping, due to poor sewage, things like that. But what I can say is that we do have our city government, our local city government is very responsible in terms of constantly working with the EPA to check the water to make sure that it is healthy at the source. The problem is, how do we get that source water to the people without it being contaminated? And that's where our $1 billion infrastructure problem comes in.
I want to switch gears just a bit and talk for a minute about climate change. So what impact would you say that climate change has on Black communities, especially those with a lot of lower income residents?
Are you all able to still hear me? Okay. Because of climate change and the many natural disasters we've experienced, prior to even last year, prior to COVID, right before COVID and right before the prison uprising, we also had another water crisis where it got cold enough that it caused a crack in our main, in the main bodies, the name of the bodies, the big water basins that hold all the water for the city. Those basins experienced a crack. And so the water was leaking out, and it had gotten so low that over 20,000, 30,000 residents were without water on New Year's Day, right? And so that required, immediate response where the city was able to get the water restored within that same day. And by the next day, most people still have their water restored. But these are just like things that are consistently happening, right? And so, and that was because we had weather that we hadn't experienced before. It got colder. It didn't get as cold as it did earlier this year. And so what we've seen is that climate is significantly, the extreme conditions are increasing year by year. In 2019, we saw the water basins crack because of the cold weather. In 2020, we saw conditions worsen. And then in 2021, we saw, this Arctic blast that wiped us out for weeks, for nearly a month. And so what it's done is it's caused our communities to actually begin to think about climate and climate change and the climate crisis. And so now when we talk about water, when we talk about rapid response, community members are now also talking about climate change and the dangers of not being prepared for the crisis of climate disaster that is always present with us now, but it also is something that people are ready to organize around. And so many of our members are part of many coalition efforts on a national basis, including work with the Movement for Black Lives, a Gulf Coast for a Green New Deal, where we're working to push policy that actually addresses some of the climate issues, including fracking. Another environmental injustice that occurred in Mississippi on the Gulf Coast was the BP oil spill. That still has impact on our communities to this day, right? And so climate change has become something that is not just, something that we talk or hear about on TV. It's something that people directly are impacted by and are ready to move and organize towards.
Thank you. Based on your experience with climate change, the water crisis, and just environmental issues in general, what factors do you think contribute the most to the impact of environmental racism, especially on Black communities?
Yeah. What impacts us the most is honestly the divestment from our communities. It is the failure of the state to, one, create policies and practices and provide resources that allow us to live our best lives. It is the state's desire for capital over people, where they allow fracking to happen, causing us to have stronger tornadoes, more frequent hurricanes that directly impact our communities. Right after the winter storm, we had a tropical storm that flooded many rural communities, Black rural communities. Right after that tropical storm, we had a tornado that hit the city of Jackson, including my neighborhood, which we are still recovering from. Right after that tornado, we then had Hurricane Ida. If you don't see the correlation between what we're doing out there on the coast in the sea by fracking, if you don't see the correlation by what we're doing by allowing all of these toxins, Mississippi has some of the most lenient policies and rules around dumping, around toxins that are allowed to be in communities. And so as we begin to see all of these things, we are definitely impacted environmentally. And so, you know, we have to see stronger policies that actually protect the environment and therefore protect ourselves. And we have to see more resources provided to our communities, which are most vulnerable, because we do not have the economic base. We do not have the economic base to have a rapid response bag ready every time a crisis happens. We don't have the money to repurchase groceries that have gone bad because we didn't have electricity for 3 weeks, right? So many residents, that's all they said is, can you just help me get some more groceries? I had just literally, it was during a pay period that this winter storm happened. And so people had just went out and filled up their refrigerators and then came home and literally no electricity, all the food gone bad. And people had to choose between whether they were going to buy groceries or pay their rent, buy groceries or pay their utility bill, and they didn't even have electricity in the first place, or buy groceries and pay their water bill. So, I mean, these are things that we don't think about. And this climate crisis is causing us great harm.
So before we close up, we have another question from one of the international jurists, okay?
Good morning. Thank you very much for your very valuable testimony. As resident of an island that was hit by 2 hurricanes, one after the other, we experienced firsthand the necessity of aid from the government institutions and usually the lack of it. I just wanted to ask you, how did the federal government respond to what you just described of the time that you spend without water because of the bursting of the water pipes, then the flooding, then the tropical storm, then the hurricane? What has been, for example, the role of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if any at all? And what has been the role of the state government? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the state government. The state government, thank you for that question. And I know that you know what it feels like to live in a space that is constantly in the way of climate crises. The state government has been helpful to a small part, right? And the only reason I give them that credit is because they have been forced to give something. Each year, Black leadership, not just including the current administration, but Black administrations in the past requested funding from the state to fix literally the same problems we're talking about today with our water infrastructure. And were denied. Right before this winter storm, this Arctic blast that caused the water crisis of 2021, the city administration had requested $47 million from the state to begin to fix the infrastructure problem. The governor denied it. Then this happens. Because of many people in our communities, as well as national movement, was forced forced the governor to actually put some funds, the governor and state legislators put some funds into Jackson. So they gave 26 million. That's how much they've given altogether to the water issue thus far. Still have not given the 47 that we've asked for. So we're still at that 26. The federal government, like I said, I think the movement of people in the streets, the work around climate, I think the work that has been happening to uplift the South and that which was often neglected in the movement. But the hard work that many of you all have done actually cast a spotlight on what was happening in Jackson. And so the federal government, for the first time in a long time, or at least from what I can remember, bypassed the state and sent 46 million to Jackson to begin immediate repairs, just so we can begin to see some improvement in our water infrastructure. So we are seeing some support from the federal government. We want to see a whole lot more. We want to see a whole lot more.
And one last part of the question. If you compare the answer of the government institutions, for example, have any of the white communities had any part in these problems? Have they been impacted in any way, the way that Jackson was impacted? And has there been a difference in the way that the governments have handled the situation in the white communities?
Yeah, so, so in Jackson, there's a very small white community. And so that community, a significant portion of that community experienced the same water crisis we experienced. Those who were closer to the water source, they didn't have, their problem wasn't as bad. But I can say across the city, we all experienced it, right? Everybody did. Everybody experienced the neglect. I think that also caused, the governor and the state legislators to finally have to do something when white folks also started to complain from Jackson, saying we still don't have water, right? The difference is that in many of those communities, they were able to leave and go to their houses in another place, in another rural community or city or out of state. They have friends in other places where they can go and be comfortable, right? Or they were able to afford hotels that had somehow figured out ways to provide water or generators for heat and electricity to their residents there. And so the rest of Jackson, who did not have those resources and were relying significantly on just the city and community-based organizations, didn't have that choice, didn't have that option, unless we were providing it to them. So, but if you look outside of Jackson, and the reason I have to distinguish that is that Jackson is a predominantly Black city. When I say that the state willfully neglects to fund it, I mean the entire city. They don't care if it's white people in there or not. They're not funding it. So we all experience what we experience right in Jackson. When you go right outside of Jackson to the areas of Madison, the rural area, the suburbs, what we would consider the suburbs, Madison County, Rankin County, what you see is that, yes, the state didn't have to send them more money because the state had already been sending them money. So when this happened, they weren't in the dire situation that Jackson was in because they already had the resources, if that makes any sense.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And we're going to play a very, very short clip that was provided by Rukia Lumumba with the People's Advocacy Center, just basically putting some faces to some of the work that they are doing at this particular point. It's just a very, very short, brief clip. I'm not quite sure if it's keyed up.
And while it's keying up, I can just say that this was a video during the water crisis, the winter storm. And so this goes back to those 5 weeks where people were without water. And these are just community members that came together to provide support to each other.
Thank you very much. We really need it.
I'm blessed to get the water, and y'all doing a great job.
Thank y'all for coming out. I need water. Appreciate it.
I feel wonderful today, just helping the community and just helping my people. I feel wonderful.
We seen the need, we came through with the water trying to fill the need, you know what I'm saying?
So we don't mind
We
still struggling, but we still help. We still help.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm Nkechi Taifa, serving as Chief People's Counsel for this International Tribunal. We're going to continue our discussion of Count 4, environmental racism, and I would like to bring to the podium Justin Hansford, who is the director of the Howard University School of Law, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and as well as this movement lawyering conference. And he will be directing the testimony of Dr. Wende Marshall, a professor at Temple University. Thank you very much. Professor Justin Hansford.
Thank you. May it please the court. My name is Justin Hansford, professor at Howard University, and it is my honor to be having a conversation this morning with our witness. Witness, can you please share your name and occupation with the tribunal?
My name is Wende Marshall, and I am not a professor at Temple University. I'm an adjunct at Temple University.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Dr. Marshall, the current unprecedented moment of climate catastrophe has deep history. What is the relationship of Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies to the environmental crisis that we currently face?
Thank you, Justin. I want to begin with the resonant words of the brilliant Laguno Pueblo author Leslie Marmon Silko and the ancestor Aimé Césaire, the fierce poet, theorist, and founder of the Nayyirah movement. I do that because I want to make sure that people are clear that data and statistics are not going to get it here. So first, Silko. So Silko wrote, "We are all part of the old stories, whether we know the stories or not. The old stories know about us. From time immemorial, the old stories encompass all events, past and future. The spirits of the ancestors cry out for justice. Their voices are louder now. The mountains shake and fall. The hurricane winds scour the earth. Fire and flood engulf the cities as the ancestor spirits announce the time will return. There will be no peace in the Americas until there is justice for the earth and her children." Second is Poetry and Knowledge from Aimé Césaire, who argued that while science produced a certain impression of the world, it was summary and superficial. He wrote, "Physics classifies and explains, but the essence of things eludes it. As for mathematics, what eludes its abstract and logical activity is reality itself. In short, scientific knowledge enumerates, measures, classifies, and kills. But it is not sufficient to state that scientific knowledge is summary. It is necessary to add that it is poor and half-starved. To acquire it, mankind has sacrificed everything: desires, fears, feelings, and impoverished knowledge, I submit. For at its inception, whatever other wealth that it may have, there stands an impoverished humanity." So Césaire's work in Poetry and Knowledge warns us that statistical portraits, counting, and classification are limited means of understanding humanity. Understanding humanity requires us to look around and see and feel the vast web of environmental, political, economic, spiritual destruction in which we are embedded, and the disproportionate and deadly, often state and corporate sponsored harm that befalls Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. 500 years into this Western experience with racialized capitalism, Black labor is still exploited, our cultures and knowledges still demoted and repressed. We die prematurely, we struggle to live, we are unable to breathe. The rising floods and raging fires, hurricanes and tornadoes presage a planet inhospitable to humanity. We are in the struggle of and for our lives. The crises we face are multidimensional: political, epidemiological, environmental. White supremacy and capitalism joined from the beginning to produce processes of destruction which now reach crescendo. Euro-American wealth began at the nexus of the privatization of the means of sustenance, the enclosure of the land, and the enforced proletarianization of the masses in Europe. The conquest of the African continent, the forced transportation of 12 million Black bodies, and the genocidal theft of these indigenous lands. The blood and sweat of Africans transported to this hemisphere and the vast stolen lands of our indigenous siblings were the basis of the concentrated financial and political power of an exceedingly small white owning class. The earth and the people are raped, pillaged, and exploited. Fueled by white greed and the drive for profit, our lives have never mattered much, except as essential exploited labor. Perceived as an inanimate resource, the earth, our mother, has never mattered much, except as a means of accruing wealth. Marx's concept of the metabolic rift captured the material estrangement of human beings in capitalist society from the natural conditions of their existence. The theory of the rift was based upon the notions of reciprocity and mutuality between nature and humans who are understood as part of nature. This is a crucial part of understanding racialized capitalism and settler colonialism, because the imperative of profit creates successive waves of destruction. There is a correlation between air toxicity, race, class, cancer, and COVID, evident in the destroyed lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. The relationship between water contamination and disease, especially for rural people, farm workers, and Indigenous people, is clear. Water flowing through poisoned pipes in Newark, Chicago, Flint, and elsewhere is connected to neurodevelopmental damage and to the mass criminalization of our children. A warming world creates more powerful storms, and it is Indigenous people in Louisiana, immigrants in New York City, and other communities of color who are dispossessed and who die when the waters rise. The year 2020 was the hottest year for the Earth's surface. Driven in large part by industrial agriculture and fossil fuel extraction, greenhouse gas concentrations reached a record high. In the summer of 2020, Arctic ice mass was at the lowest level since record keeping began in the 1970s. Rapid loss of the Earth's ice mitigates the role that ice plays in lowering Earth's temperature by reflecting heat back into space. It raises sea levels and warms the oceans, processes which intensify climate catastrophe and further cycles of dispossession. Driven by capitalism's profit imperative, the myth of endless growth on a finite planet, and a hegemonic ethos that justifies the exploitation and murder of natural and human life, the world is experiencing the sixth mass extinction. Half of known vertebrate species, nearly 1/3, have been obliterated. 177 mammal species have lost 30% of their geographic ranges, and more than 40% of such mammals have experienced severe population decline. This data on biological annihilation indicates that beyond global species extinctions, Earth is experiencing a huge episode of population declines and extirpations, which will have negative cascading consequences on ecosystem functioning and services vital to sustaining civilization. Described by researchers as possibly the most serious threat to the persistence of civilization, the sixth mass extinction is irreversible. The loss of natural life is permanent. the increasing emergence of novel pathogens, along with the destruction of soil and water, deforestation, the torture of animals and industrial agriculture, declining nutrition, land dispossession, and farmer suicide stem from capital's rigorous exigency for profit. Across the globe, capital is encroaching on the last of primary forests and of peasant-held farmlands. Deforestation and development catalyze the emergence of diseases into human populations that were once contained by the border between developed lands and the primary forests. The diversity and complexity of primary forest ecosystems, including wildlife and pathogens, are let loose by capitalism's drive for profit, causing spillover into life and humans. At the center of this 500-year-old conflagration, this epic of death and destruction, is a profound contempt for the sanctity of Earth and her people. Having the data to support claims of human rights abuses and genocide is important, but equally important is hearing the voices of the ancestors and of the rivers and the sea, of the mountains and the sky. The ancestor and revolutionary Berta Cáceres reminds us of this. "Let us wake up," she said. "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free of the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that statement. I want to also bring in the United Nations standards, specifically the Human Rights Council's statement that human beings have the right to clean air, health, and a safe climate, rights that are not contingent upon one's race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious background. In light of the profound statements you just shared with us, do you believe that BIPOC people have been deprived of access to these basic rights in a disproportionate way that would violate this principle from the United Nations?
Yes, absolutely. Every day in very many ways. I mean, there's ample data that supports the relationship between the toxicity of the air we breathe and the development of asthma, COVID, cancer in Black, brown, and Indigenous bodies, of toxic pipes and toxic water damaging our children and lurking in our bodies, ready to explode as we age. Ample evidence that building environments, mold, mildew, road dust, construction dust, all those things contribute more, press more on Black bodies, cause more harm in Black bodies. And there was a study released recently, let me see if I can find it, found that that there's this huge disproportion between the pollution and toxicity generated by white consumption practices and the pollution that is largely caused by white consumption practices is disproportionately affects Black and brown bodies. I don't, somewhere in my notes is the exact thing. But so the question is, no, the United States does not live up to those United Nations standards at all.
Thank you. Thank you. I also have a question here from one of the jurists who would like to approach the podium.
Dr. Marshall, I am Bina Nepram from India, and I would like to pose this question to you. What are the specific forms of environmental violence that Black, brown, and Indigenous people have faced in the United States of America? Any examples of pesticide poisoning, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, militarization, wastes being dumped on Indigenous people's land and lands where Black, brown communities and the poor are based in? What about any examples of chemical warfare in terms of drugs infusion in the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities? And the level of toxicity which has been dumped every day, as you mentioned, for the last 500 years on our lives and on our present and future. Thank you.
Well, here's one interesting fact, that Navajo Nation water systems are poisoned with uranium and arsenic, stemming from 17th and 18th century colonial mining in those places. So that's an interesting little factoid, because it sort of helps us grasp the depth of the problem. This country occupies blood-soaked ground, and the toxicity, which is both spiritual as well as material in the forms of toxic air and water and all that, is quotidian in the lives of everyone, actually, but has a greater impact on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, on working class people across the United States. One example is the water crisis in Flint, which has enduring effects. And it's frustrating too, because, you know, science seeks to prove things. The requirements of science for proof are rigorous, and fail to capture the human suffering that goes on. So the demand for special services for children in schools has skyrocketed in Flint, which is the result of children ingesting polluted water through polluted pipes. So, yeah.
No, thank you for that. I'm going to change gears a bit and ask about a particular statement regarding toxic waste and other pollutants. Statement by Reverend Ben Chavis in 1987. And his statement in coalition with United Church of Christ in its Commission for Racial Justice, and a report that was called Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. So 35 years after that report, which was a groundbreaking report which established the impact of toxic waste on communities of color in the United States, how are we seeing the progression or the regression of efforts to lessen toxic waste and other pollutants in our communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. The United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice report, Toxic and Race in the US, found that race was the most significant variable in the location of commercial hazardous waste sites nationally, and that's still true. That 3 out of 5 commercial hazardous waste sites were in predominantly Black or Latinx communities, and that the landfills in Black and Brown communities accounted for 40% of the total estimated commercial landfill capacity in the US. So 35 years later, things are worse, not least because climate catastrophe is further along, disrupting our lives, damaging our lives, killing us more quickly and with more intensity than in the 80s when Ben Chavis and his crew wrote this report. But so just to trot out some statistics, the closer you are to a Superfund site, the more likely you will find African-American families. Superfund was the US effort to clean up toxic waste sites. And it was also found that there was bias in the initial phase of Superfund cleanup against sites located in Black and urban neighborhoods. So wealthier, whiter, suburban neighborhoods were bumped to the top of the list. 30% of Black folks in South Carolina were living in Superfund hosted census tracts. And among all populations in South Carolina living below poverty, 50% were living in Superfund host sites. So I point you in the direction of a joint study by the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force, which found that the air in Black communities violates air quality standards for ozone smog, and that Black children suffer 138,000 asthma attacks and 101,000 lost days of school each year. I'm a little suspicious about those numbers, but they make the point. More than 6.7 million Black folks live in the 91 counties with oil refineries, including Philadelphia. This is really important to consider. The downwind air pollution from natural gas facilities in Pennsylvania and West Virginia impacted the air quality of the Baltimore District of Columbia corridor, creating many, many days of elevated smog and air quality that was unhealthy level. And it's a downwind experience. In Philly, the fossil fuel refinery in South Philly is responsible for 72% of the toxic air emissions, which contribute to childhood asthma. It is twice the national average. And Black people are 75% more likely than others to live in fence-lined communities defined as areas near the production of hazardous wastes. So you can see that nothing has changed and things have gotten worse. And there's reams of studies which demonstrate these facts.
Thank you. We have a question, I believe, from our chief jurist.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. Dr. Marshall, I want to raise, it's a conundrum I think that we are facing in terms of the issues of environmental racism versus climate change, and at which point do they find resonance, and at which point do they find dissonance. So I think the first thing that I want to understand from your point when you speak of capital, consumerism, etc., is, and I want to answer this question, in practical legal terms, in a formal, in order to hold, for example, liability, which I will get to in a short bit. But the issue of is development then an impediment on environmental racism or climate change? That's the one conundrum that I think we must resolve. And just to get, maybe you have supporting written submission to that effect. The second thing that I want to raise is the issue of, yes, I agree with the colonialism and etc. And Marx's understanding of equality and equal sharing of the resources of the people, but also Lenin's philosophy, Lenin's thinking around electrification was critical, and obviously with electrification there needed to become the issue of the utilization of natural resources. Now I want to get to this issue, and that is the issue of why are we, in terms of environmental racism, not classifying issues of contamination, etc., as being punishable offenses, which bear corporate taxes or corporate penalties? Should there be such a situation that arises under, one, the aspect of the UNHCR, and secondly, under the issue of corporate responsibility in respect of not just more in respect of climate change than environmental racism? I think with environmental racism, we can lay blame at the feet of the state. So I just want to gather your expert evidence in respect of those aspects. Thank you very much, Ms. Meyer, and to Dr. Marshall.
So there's a lot in that question. But let me just say one thing on the question of corporate responsibility. The other day on a People Strike Dialogue thread, a comrade from New Orleans posted an article about how fossil fuel companies receive $11 million a minute in subsidies from the US government. That was in 2021. And it's expected to increase. So I don't think there's any way in that context we can have a serious conversation about corporate responsibility without having some control of the corporations that are extracting fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases, for example. I'm not sure about some of the other parts of your question, but I did catch the part about the issue of development. Is it an impediment? It also depends on what you mean by development. So development to increase corporate profits is a problem. We don't, at this point in the United States, have the power to think of development as something that makes homes and schools and clinics accessible. That's not what development means. I don't know so much about your question about Lenin's philosophy around electrification. I think without knowing more background of your question, I think I could say that that European socialist traditions understood industrialization as an important stage of history, and I believe that it is not, nor it wasn't necessarily inevitable, and it's not something we have to go through, because if we do, we'll kill the planet. Sorry if I misconstrue your question. And then the most interesting part of what you asked me is about whether or not the term environmental racism gets it. And I struggled with that while I was trying to figure out my testimony. Because environmental racism is a very paltry way to describe the destruction of the earth and her people. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but if you want to come back and ask me something else, but that's my take on what you asked.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. And one amendment, the statement I've read into the record earlier was from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, statement made on the 8th of January, 2019, to enter that into the record. I have one further question, Dr. Marshall. So thank you. And some of this has already been addressed earlier, but this question of how does environmental racism affect the health of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities? I know you did mention asthma earlier. I myself have asthma. You know, are there particular health impacts that we see that directly are traced to these environmental injustices?
So there's a huge body of literature that details the sort of deadly health consequences for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of the destruction of the environment. And in addition to, to the air pollution ones that include COVID and asthma, cancers and stuff like that, there's also issues of birth outcomes, for example, that environmental issues cause or exacerbate elevated levels of premature births, well as low birth weight and infant and maternal mortality. And that environmental thing includes both toxic air and water, as well as environmental indices in the built environment, like housing damage, property disorder, tenure, vacancy, and all that, mold, mildew. Those things are all associated with negative birth outcomes. Aside from that, there's just the exposure to everyday toxins. So, from the broad level of air pollution and water, contaminated water, to the level of what people are breathing in their homes, all of these environmental toxins have a huge impact on the health and longevity of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. You can see that in the impact of COVID. Studies have shown that air pollution increased COVID rates among Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who live near dirty air, and almost all of us do. So, yeah, So the answer is that there's lots and lots of data to support it. Even when, you know, the way that capitalism does science, they're hesitant to point to correlation. I would urge people to look around, assess the state of our people and our siblings, and understand that we live in a declining empire and all that entails, and that the building of this empire is based on our blood and our land, and that its decline is hitting us harder than anyone else.
Thank you so much. And I would remind the jurists that the charge includes deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, including the loss of the ability to have healthy opportunities for reproduction and lessened life expectancy. Dr. Marshall, so in conclusion, are there any other final statements you would like to make this morning?
I mean, just that, like in terms of reproduction, there's also all kinds of studies, I shouldn't say they're all kinds, but there are many studies that look at the role that chemical pollutants play in reproductive systems of various species, and very likely including humans. So at that level, I think that's important to understand, that reproduction of many species is impacted by the shit of capitalism.
Right. On that note, thank you so much for your testimony, Dr. Marshall, honorable jurists. No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We will now hear pre-recorded testimony of environmental justice expert Imani Jacqueline Brown, whose testimony will be directed, pre-recorded by attorney Cynthia Roseberry. And so as soon as we get that keyed up, we're going to, one moment, did the jurors, okay. We're going to listen to this extremely informative expert testimony. Thank you.
Roseberry. I am a criminal defense attorney and justice warrior. I'll be examining expert Ms. Imani Brown today regarding count 4, environmental racism. Hello, Ms. Brown. Can you tell us your name and give us some background and describe your expertise, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Imani Jacqueline Brown. I'm an environmental justice activist from New Orleans, Louisiana in the US. For more than 10 years, I have studied fossil fuel extraction and production, and particularly how the fossil fuel industry maintains the racialized spatial logics of settler colonialism and slavery. I fight for fossil fuel accountability and reparations for the multi-generational environmental and human rights crises plaguing my home state of Louisiana as a result of fossil fuel production. I received my BA in anthropology from Columbia University in 2010 and my master's in forensic architecture from the University of London in 2019. The phrase forensic architecture describes an emergent field of study, a research methodology, as well as a research agency based at Goldsmiths, University of London, and I currently work as a researcher with forensic architecture. It is in that capacity that I speak with you today.
Thank you. So can you further describe forensic architecture specifically with respect to research in environmental racism for us?
Absolutely. So forensic architecture investigates human rights violations and environmental violence perpetrated by states, police forces, militaries, and corporations around the world. So we work in partnership with institutions across civil society, from grassroots activists to legal teams to international NGOs and media organizations in order to carry out investigations with and on behalf of communities and individuals who are affected by conflict, police brutality, environmental violence, and border regimes. Our investigations specifically employ cutting-edge technologies in spatial and architectural analysis, as well as open source investigation, digital modeling, and immersive technologies. And we also employ grassroots research, documentary research, situated interviews, and collaboration with activists and academics. Findings from our investigations have been presented in national and international courtrooms, parliamentary inquiries, as well as exhibitions at cultural institutions and in international media. In addition, our work is included as testimony around the world in citizens' tribunals and community assemblies. To speak specifically about how our work into environmental racism in Louisiana, I'll start in 2020. Last year, Forensic Architecture was commissioned by Rise St. James, which is a Louisiana-based grassroots fence line community activist organization based in St. James, Louisiana. To just define the word fence line, a fence line community is a community that shares a property line with an industrial facility. Rise St. James and their legal counsel, the Center for Constitutional Rights, have been fighting the permits that the state of Louisiana and the parish of St. James have offered to Formosa Plastics, a petrochemical company that seeks to construct a 3.5 square mile plastic nurdle production facility just outside of the small, rural, majority Black town of Welcome, Louisiana. In addition to several other petrochemical plants that are currently in the permitting or construction process. So Rise and the Center for Constitutional Rights asked us to help them investigate environmental racism throughout Louisiana's petrochemical corridor, which is also known as Cancer Alley, as described in the indictment. Cancer Alley is defined in many different ways, depending on whether we're measuring the region along the river or otherwise, but it's an 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans as the crow flies, where over 200 formerly slave-powered sugarcane plantations are now occupied by some of the most polluting oil and gas production facilities in the United States. In 2019, 4 cemeteries that hold the remains of historically enslaved people were identified by an archaeology firm that was hired by Rise St. James. One cemetery had likely already been destroyed many years ago by a waste retention pond on the Mosaic Corporation's diammonium phosphate fertilizer plant. The other 3 are at risk of desecration by the construction of Formosa Plastics' new facility, which they call the Sunshine Project. So why, of course, are there these cemeteries of enslaved people on these industrial sites and industrial construction sites? So we learned from Rise and from this archaeology firm that historically, every single plantation had at least 1 and sometimes as many as 3 cemeteries for enslaved people. As such, if Cancer Alley, the petrochemical corridor, which was formerly constituted by hundreds of sugarcane plantations and formerly known as plantation country, Cancer Alley was formerly known as plantation country, and there are upwards of 500 plantations between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Historically, each plantation had at least 1 and as many as 3 cemeteries for its enslaved population. As such, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of historical antebellum Black cemeteries that are at risk from future industrial activity, in addition to those that have already been desecrated by the existing 200 or so facilities in the region. In addition, of course, to desecrating historic cemeteries, existing and future industrial facilities poison the air of these historic majority Black communities that populate this area and that were founded by emancipated peoples in the years after the Civil War. So Rise St. James and the Center for Constitutional Rights asked Forensic Architecture to assist them in identifying these lost and erased cemeteries for historically enslaved people. and also to draw into visibility the other chemical emissions, the invisible chemical emissions that saturate the air and that majority Black residents of this region are forced to breathe. In order to try to develop a predictive method for locating historic cemeteries throughout the region, we sourced and analyzed a collection of primary source documents that span 300 years, including historic maps, aerial photography, and satellite imaging. As we combine these materials, we were able to build a digital portal through which we could study the transformation of the land across these decades. We also discerned the spatial logics of the industrial sugarcane plantation. We decoded the symbology used to represent some cemeteries, which are mapped, as well as other structures such as slave quarters and the slave master's big house, as well as other landmarks. And we learned to read the surface of the earth as visible through these historic aerial photographs, discerning traces of the past that have been left off of the maps, and also tracking the transformation and persistence of racialized land use practices across the various developmental stages of corporate colonial capitalism in this region. Through this research process, we were able to identify over 1,000 probable sites of historic and cultural value, including antebellum Black cemeteries, hundreds of which have already been topographically erased by industrial development over the decades, which does not consider Black cultural and historic sites to be worthy of preservation. At this point, I'll pause for a moment and see if I can share my screen and share a clip from the investigative film that we produced. Let's see if I can make this work. So each of our investigations produces an investigative film that is designed to share our research methodology and our findings with a broad public. So this is an excerpt showing as I hope you can see now, a mosaic of Black and white images. It is an aerial mosaic using photographs captured by a small plane piloted by USDA in 1940. We geo-referenced, that is, we pinned each of these hundreds of photographs to a contemporary satellite image and mosaic them in this way so that we can actually recreate a view of the region in 1940. And this is prior to the advent of Cancer Alley. So I'll play this clip now. In teal, we can see all of the probable cultural and historical sites, including cemeteries identified in 1940 and now, all that remain in 2021. I'll share this clip as well so that it can be viewed by the tribunal at a later point. Going back to 1940, we can now bring in a window showing a few of these kind of Black patches in these images. These groves of trees were identified as possible cemeteries. We learned through our research that historically enslaved people would be forced to construct their cemeteries toward the back of the plantation at the time of the cemetery's construction, and that they would often plant certain species of trees as grave markers, both in lieu of having access to stone to mark the grave sites of their loved ones, but also continuing a Pan-African and global indigenous tradition that that saw trees as bearing immense spiritual as well as cultural significance. So these trees that were planted by historically enslaved people would grow, thrive, would reproduce, and are present in the topographical record in the 20th century and sometimes today as this patch of trees. So identifying these possible cemeteries here in red, we can see how they have been desecrated between 1940 and the present day by whether industrial development or the continuation of industrial agriculture. So our research enables local communities to recover these sites that have these possible historic and cultural sites that have already been erased. So in addition to this research into cemeteries of historically enslaved people that have already been subject to or are threatened by erasure, we mobilized another suite of technologies, including fluid dynamic simulation and something called optical gas imaging, in order to render invisible chemical emissions visible, exposing the scores of both criteria and toxic air pollutants that communities in Cancer Alley are forced to breathe. Our endeavor with this work was to bring visibility to the long-standing claims of these majority Black communities. So I'll now share another clip briefly. This one's quite a bit longer. I'll speak over it and possibly fast forward through it. So ultimately, actually, perhaps it's better if I share this clip a little bit later, because I have, I can discuss then at length the process, our methodology for kind of, for visualizing this data set. But I'll just show it quickly. You can see that we have modeled 6 different criteria in toxic air emissions, including particulate matter, which causes great respiratory distress, known carcinogens such as chloroprene, ethylene oxide, and benzene, as well as ammonia, and another known carcinogen, nitrogen oxides, and each one is represented by a different color. We modeled according to different meteorological conditions to show the disproportionate impact of majority Black communities in the region. But I'll pause this for now and we can return to it at a slightly later point in the interview. So I'll pause now.
Thank you for that fascinating work, and it brings another element to the idiom "Southern trees bearing strange fruit," right? So I want to focus you. Let's go back to the Black cemeteries, these antebellum Black cemeteries, and I want to ask you if you've uncovered any existing state or federal laws that can protect these cemeteries, the ones that we have left.
Great. So just to clarify, in the U.S. state of Louisiana is across the United States. If a developer, an industrial developer, needs to get federal permits for their development, they are required to conduct what's called a cultural resource survey to identify any cultural or historic resources that might be impacted by their development. Each state is basically required to, have a division of archaeology to ensure that developers meet the criteria laid out in these federal laws. In theory, Louisiana has its own suite of state laws that are, in theory, among the most comprehensive in the country, providing additional protection to cemeteries. At the federal level, these laws were drafted. These state laws were drafted in response to the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is known as NAGPRA, which was passed in 1992. And the state laws were designed to try to close many of the gaps in cemetery protections at that time. These laws were designed to give special consideration to the unique precarity of Indigenous burial grounds throughout the state of Louisiana, which were often subject to grave robbing by collectors. There are, however, no laws that take into consideration the unique precarity of Black burial grounds, which are themselves uniquely threatened by present-day industrial development, as well as by these many centuries of dehumanization, devaluation, neglect, and erasure. As they stand, both state and federal laws and the regulatory policies that enforce them are powerless to combat the rampant conflicts of interest that pervade decisions around land use in Louisiana's petrochemical corridor. So there are possibilities for transformation, and there are a number of nation legal efforts on the ground in Louisiana that are working to radically overhaul cemetery law. Our work was designed to help build a body of evidence that local residents can use as they make the case for overhaul.
Thank you for that. So I know you've spoken about the historic development of this petrochemical corridor and acknowledged that, you know, it's Cancer Alley, and, you know, based on the film that you've shown, it suggests that Black residents are more directly or most directly impacted. But would you argue that this planning process that constitutes the intentional targeting of communities in Cancer Alley?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it is really important to be specific about how this region has developed historically. So, you know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, after emancipation, small majority Black towns grew from rows of plantation slave quarters. These so-called free towns have become today's fence line communities, and they share property lines with these massive industrial facilities. There is a really important example of this, the town of Lyons in St. John the Baptist Parish, which, if I can share my screen once again, I can share a clip that can just visualize this really neatly for us. So we're looking now at a map from 1894. We're moving forward in time through this aerial photography to see how the town of Lyons has been completely eradicated by the construction of this massive oil refinery owned by Marathon, as well as a smaller production facility owned by Cargill Inc. Again, I can share this clip because it goes quite fast, so you can really see how this landscape is transformed. All of the land we can see here in yellow are parcels of land. This data comes from the St. John the Baptist Parish tax assessor, are currently owned by Marathon, with only 5 parcels of land remaining in the hands of residents. We can see that these 2 historic cemeteries are themselves surrounded by industry, and that Marathon somehow even owns a portion of one of these cemeteries. So again, I'll share this clip with the tribunal. So to speak, to go back to the example of, to go back to St. James Parish and provide another example of how the planning process directly targets Black communities. In St. James Parish around 2014, the parish council barred 2 companies, Wolverine and Petroplex, from constructing facilities in the majority white 3rd district. Yet since that same year, 2014, over half a dozen new facilities have been constructed or approved and are pending construction in the majority Black 5th district, including the facility owned by Formosa, which lies next to the community of Welcome. I'd like to share another piece of evidence, or a few pieces of evidence. Let's see how I can do this most efficiently. I'll just share the entire screen here. So what we're looking at right now is the St. James Parish Government Comprehensive Plan visioning forward to 2031. It was originally drafted in 2011 as part of a public planning process, but it was not approved until 2014. And when it was approved in 2014, there were additional pages added on to the back that we'll take a look at. That was the cover we're looking at there. So the plan articulates that it is designed to articulate a vision of future growth within the parish that will sustain the values of its citizens. Now, we might ask, what are those values? Well, the plan is, again, very direct about what those values are. On the subsequent page, it reminisces about the age of so-called fabulous plantation life in St. James, an age when acreage was counted by thousands and slaves by hundreds. It was the day, it continues, of luxurious living, of sumptuous entertainment, of delightful ease. It goes on to speak about how while there are many settlers who later came to claim the parish's home, the French Creoles and Acadians, that is the white settlers, remain the predominant population whose strong cultural influence continues to this day. Now, we can understand then how this plan, and this is, we're looking now at the revised 2014 version, could then go on to redesignate the parish's majority Black communities as both industrial. So we're looking here in purple is the 5th district, the majority Black, around 86% Black district of St. James Parish, which was rezoned as an industrial zone. I'm sorry, let me clarify, redesignated, because this was not an official zoning process, but a planning process. It was redesignated as an industrial zone. Here in beige is the community of Welcome, which was redesignated as existing residential / future industrial. The founder of Rise St. James, a woman by the name of Sharon Levine, says that she feels that her parish government is trying to wipe her out through the approval of this plan. In this way, we can certainly point to this plan as evidence of the direct targeting of Black communities, targeting for erasure and dispossession of their historic land.
Thank you. So you've mentioned and showed us a graphic on air emissions. I want to talk a little bit about state and federal regulations and how they fail to protect Black communities. And then ask you, is this environmental racism in Louisiana constrained to Cancer Alley?
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and I'll speak over this clip so that we can kind of get it in as we're, so let me go back to the beginning here. Essentially, the EPA directs states to set their air quality standards. So we're looking now at the website of the Department of Environmental Quality in Louisiana. Among all the states in the US, the state of Louisiana has some of the loosest air emission standards in the country. According to the investigative news agency ProPublica, Louisiana does not regularly monitor air near major polluters like other states. And while the EPA considers the effect of a variety of chemicals taken together, Louisiana only looks at one chemical at a time, which potentially undercounts the true effect on air quality. Now, as I mentioned, we've conducted a study that looks at 6 different emissions, 5 chemicals, and particulate matter over the course of 3 separate days, each with different meteorological conditions and different prevailing wind directions to show how the variety of communities in this area are impacted. The Air Permitting Division of the DEQ maintains an inventory of both permitted and actual emissions of criteria, pollutants and toxic air pollutants. And that's the data set that we're using in order to generate this simulation. The problem, of course, is that actual emissions are reported by industry, and the state trusts the figures that are provided by industry. When we look at permitted emissions, we're only looking at an estimate of what once again, the plants imagine that they are going to be emitting. So we have to take all of this data with a grain of salt and recognize that in many cases it could be vastly underestimating the total amount of emissions that communities will be subject to. What we then did, in addition to basically, so we chose to visualize permitted emissions so that we could take into account those facilities that have not yet been constructed and therefore present the state's vision of the future of this region. We then we decided to simulate the average emissions rather than the maximum emissions from these facilities. And then we were able, from this data set, we were able to then estimate the average concentration of each chemical in the air. So looking now, we are seeing the average concentration of particulate matter in different prevailing wind conditions. And going, I'll like move forward through this, and again, I'll submit this, this video. We can see that different communities are impacted under different wind conditions. So for example, when the wind blows from the southwest, the community of Laplace, which has been one of the most devastated by the recent Hurricane Ida, is saturated by high concentrations of chloroprene. We move over now to the community of Welcome, which is sandwiched between two permitted facilities that are pending construction unless activists can block their construction. And we can see how Welcome is saturated in high concentrations of nitrogen oxide, as well as high concentrations of ethylene oxide, both of which are known and suspected carcinogens. Now, when I mentioned earlier that Louisiana's air quality standards are among the lowest in the nation, we can sort of see that visualized here. So we can see the concentration of ethylene oxide that would be saturating Welcome if Formosa Plastics is constructed on the far right. We can then see what the EPA's threshold for cancer risk is considered to be. Well, Louisiana only considers the very topmost margin of the EPA's own threshold, right? And so Louisiana's air emission standards are setting communities up basically to be subjected to a far greater risk than even the EPA's own standards would allow. I'll stop sharing here.
So thank you so much for providing this information. I just want to give you 30 seconds or space to sum up or wrap up if you'd like to.
Thank you very much. I mean, I just like to wrap up to just say that, you know, while we have focused here on Cancer Alley, the, you know, entire geography of fossil fuel production, which, you know, exists within the coastal zone of southeastern Louisiana, is rife with ecological violence. Cancer Alley is merely the end of the long cycle of fossil fuel production, which spans from thousands of offshore wells in the Gulf of Mexico to over 80,000 oil and gas wells throughout Louisiana's coastal wetlands. These wells and rigs connect through 50,000 miles of pipeline up to Cancer Alley. There is environmental violence all along this cycle. 10,000 miles of canals have been dredged in order to drill those 80,000 wells. These canals bring in salt water from the Gulf, which kill vegetation that holds the land together. So Louisiana is quite literally disintegrating at a material level. We are facing one of the fastest rates of coastal erosion in the world as a result of fossil fuel production. As the coast disintegrates, coastal communities are at greater risk from some of the increasingly destructive, increasingly frequent hurricanes that come off the Gulf of Mexico, storms like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Laura, and Hurricane Ida most recently. It has widely been reported, including in the indictment, that Black and Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by hurricanes. In addition to disintegrating the wetlands, hurricane storm surges travel up these oil and gas access and navigational canals, directly flooding coastal communities. So this entire web of oil and gas infrastructure has disrupted the ecological sustainability of this region. And it is a direct continuation of the spatial patterns that were imposed by settler colonialism and slavery. We can trace environmental racism from the original dispossession of Indigenous people of their land. The Indigenous people like the Homer were pushed from the land that is now called Cancer Alley down to the wetlands, where now they are at the front line of climate change, where they are now being dispossessed once again by this new register of environmental violence. In order for Black and Indigenous communities to survive, to live, to thrive in this place, we absolutely are dependent upon the cessation of extractive activities. We need accountability and reparations for 300 years of extractive violence perpetrated by corporate colonial actors and their modern multinational corporations that inherit their quasi-sovereign impunity. But more than this, when we look at the geography of fossil fuel production, when we look at the fossil fuel production cycle, we know that it begins with extraction, it ends in emission. Environmental racism is a planetary crisis. These facilities in Cancer Alley that are directly imperiling the lives of majority Black communities are imperiling the survival of humanity at large across the planet. So environmental racism experienced by one community in Louisiana is itself a planetary crisis. And I think that's the most important message to take away. It is in everyone's best interest to cease and to repair environmental racism.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brown, our expert forensic architect.
Thank you very much for the time, and it's a real honor to be able to contribute.
Thank you so very much, Imani Jacqueline Brown, for that testimony. We have one last brief testimony before we break for lunch, and we would like to bring forward Elder Nathan Phillips, who is an Indigenous elder. You may have seen his face, seen him face off with white supremacists on the Lincoln Memorial sometime last year, and his testimony will be directed by none other than our esteemed attorney, Cynthia Roseberry.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you state your name for the record, please?
Nathan Phillips. I'm from the Omaha tribe. I'm Tapa is my clan, and Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island I represent.
Mr. Phillips, do you consider yourself an Indigenous person?
Yes.
And as an Indigenous person, would you say you've suffered at the hands of federal, state, or local governments of the United States of America?
Yes. Suffered lots. My first experience with, I guess, with suffering is when I was 5 years old, 1960, Lincoln, Nebraska. The social service people, workers, with the help of the Lincoln Police Department, in the middle of the night, broke my mom's door down. I was 5 years old. They stole me away. I only knew my Omaha language. Now I don't know it. I was stolen away. I was denied my language, my culture, and the love of my mom and my dad. I was placed in an abusive foster home. The people beat me mercilessly. And I was told and made to say, I love you to them. Yes, I've suffered.
I'm sorry for your suffering. Can you describe, if you recall, what happened to your family, your brothers, your sisters, your mother, your father?
That night, as I said, it was dark. I was the youngest of 11. My mom and dad, Dorothy Hastings and Vernie Phillips Sr., loving parents, no doubt. My dad, my mom, they were indigenous. They believed in the original instructions, meaning they weren't Christians, meaning they weren't Muslims, they weren't Jewish. We were original peoples of Nebraska. And because they denied the system to take me away and teach me English and different, and become a different religion, my dad resisted that. So the social services said that my family was unfit. One of the things about genocide is that they say they take the children away from their families and put them in a foreign system. That is exactly what happened to me. I'm indigenous. I'm not white. I went there. I was beaten. I was terrorized in school. I went to an all-white school. Because I was raised this way, relatives, when I did find my mom when I was 15, because I would run away from that family and go look for her. I found her, and I would run away from home and go be with her. She took me up to the reservation one time. Went up there when I was 16. I had a driver's license, drove her up there. Got up there, and my own relatives, because I asked questions. Being raised the way I was, I got the same education that everybody else got in those days. A bunch of lies. So when I got back there, I wanted to see teepees. I wanted to see the buffalo. I wanted to know where could I get an Indian name. See, I have an Indian name, but I don't know it now. Because when my mom died, she was the one who knew that name. I was told one time, I don't believe it, but I was told that when it comes times for me to go to the happy hunting grounds, there will be a person there and say, "Who are you? What's your name?" Right now, all I can say is I'm nobody, because I don't know my own Indian name. I should know that.
Do you recall a time when you had an encounter with a family member who didn't recognize you after you returned because of your education and your indoctrination?
So when I went home with my mom and I asked these questions, I was standing in a group of young people, 15, 16, 17, my brothers. One of my relatives, because I asked, where can I get some moccasins? Where's the teepees? He looked at me with great disdain. Go home, white boy. That broke my heart. I wanted to come home, but because my own relatives felt I was contaminated, they didn't want me back. It's different now. I'm much sought after back home on my reservation now. I come home, Uncle Nate, Grandpa Nate, come have dinner with us. Come sit with us. Come pray with us. They still speak Omaha on my reservation, and I'm learning it, but I talk baby talk. I know how to begin my prayers in Omaha, and I know how to end my prayers in Omaha, but in between, there's a lot of English. It is hurtful that I know that these things are continuing to happen. We have a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act. We're being attacked. They're calling it a racist law, and they're trying to get rid of it so they can take our children away from us and put them in a foreign system. In other people, a different culture, a different race, away from us. We're going to lose that. That's racism. We want to keep our children. If anything, the Indian Child Welfare Act should be reinforced. And just like the Catholic people have Catholic homes, the Indigenous people should have homes too. Our own foster care system set up. But because of racism, they won't let that happen. And because of genocide, they won't let that happen. They don't want this country, they don't want the people to understand that this is our land. You broke the treaties. The treaties are broke. We didn't break them. Omaha people, the Omaha people has had nothing but peace with this government. And what happened to us? We were about 200 years ago taken down to 700 individuals. At that time, when we first met the first white man, it was French people. They say there must have been 500,000 to 2 million of us in the Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, South Dakota area right there. That was our lands. That was Omaha lands. Nebraska means flat water. That's an Omaha word. The biggest city in Omaha, Nebraska, well, I mean, Nebraska is Omaha, Nebraska. It used to be our winter campgrounds. They killed us, so we couldn't be there. We used to come in there about this time of year, to come in there and bring some firewoods, prepare the land for all the people to come to that place, because it was a very protected place. 7 Hills is a sacred place. God put us there. There was a flood, a great flood, washed everything, cleansed everything. That's how we got our name. We were way up north. They say maybe up there in those Great Lakes when it was one lake. But then it flooded and washed us almost to Texas. So that's how we got our name, Omaha, those who go against the current. We just knew that we lived up north, so we started up north. And that's how we come to Nebraska. When the flood waters receded, we seen these 7 hills. They said these 7 hills will be your home. And then further north, we have a place up there that's the oldest fireplace in America. We lit that fire, keep it going.
I'm going to turn your attention, Mr. Phillips, to your efforts to protect your land and also the efforts of your companion to protect the land. Do we have a photo? I'd like for you to look at this photograph that is shortly to appear on the screen and tell me if you recognize anyone in that photograph.
Oh, I recognize that big old ear.
Is that you?
Looks like me. Yeah, that's me.
And can you tell us about the circumstances surrounding that photograph briefly?
The circumstances in that photograph is that the young man that is facing me at that time and the young people around him they were in conflict with 5 black men. And at that point, it was just like about 5 minutes after I started singing. These guys were surrounding these men. And it really looked ugly. I said it once before, it looked like a lynch mob. A nephew came up to me and that drum, that's not my drum. I was just standing there looking on. And my heart hurt for those kids. Because maybe they didn't know what they were doing. Maybe they're taught to be that way. But what I was doing there was trying to bring about a peace between 2 races of people who are in conflict. That's what I was doing there. And what brought me there was Indigenous people coming together and trying to maintain our pride, our dignity, what we have left, and to build up our youth, respect our elders, and try to do something good out there that day. That's what we do. That's what we was doing there. When that nephew came into that drum and said, "We have to do something, Uncle," first thing I thought was, I don't have to do a damn thing. I ain't got to do nothing. That ain't my fight. But what I seen, and some people don't like me saying it, but I seen the fabric of America being torn asunder. What I seen, what I witnessed there on that mall in Washington, D.C., that's in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Just one point real quick. Abraham Lincoln is no hero to the indigenous people. He is not our hero. So at the monument there, when this was happening, a voice came to me, just like yesterday. A voice said, "Stand up." But that voice said to me, "What you going to do when you face God?" What if something happened there that day? I didn't do that. It was ugly. It was an ugly day, relatives. There was a point where they had them surrounded. I mean, they circled them up, hurling taunts at them. And there was just 4 of them, and there's hundreds of them. And these four gentlemen were getting to a point of they felt they needed to defend themselves. So when the thought came, what am I going to do if I come in front of God and something bad happened and I didn't do nothing? I would feel bad. And I still feel bad about doing something too. I was in one of those rock and hard places. So I sang a song, and the song I sang, that's a unity song. That's a song of a prayer song. Strength, courage, face the future. You know, let's do something good, people. That's what that song to me means. So I'm going to be taken into court here in a few weeks by this young gentleman. And so I can't really talk too much more about, but I've already said that much, in the news and stuff. So, but I will be given disposition on what happened there, and that'll be coming out, and you'll probably seeing that coming up too. Not looking forward to it though.
Mr. Phillips, we have a question from one of our jurors.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for your bravery and for your courage. My name is Bina Nepram, and I'm a member of the international jury, and I am an indigenous person from the northeast of India, Manipur. My question is this: 12 million indigenous people died in this part of the world since colonization took place. And 12 million indigenous people of America have actually taught what it means to survive the continuum of violence over 400, 500 years. So the question that I have for you from the jury is, genocide was a part of what happened on indigenous people's lives, lands, and territories. What do you see are the new forms of genocide are taking place now, as in 2021 and around? I want to know if you have experienced that, new forms of genocide, what I call slow genocide. And the final question is, The indigenous people's wisdom and traditional knowledge and the form of resilience and resistance is also what is going to save this planet and our future. What is it that you can tell us to the world and at this international tribunal that yours is not the story of just death and violence and repression, but one of resistance and resilience where every one of us in this world can learn from? Thank you.
Trying to piece together that question. Am I still suffering? Was part of the question? Yes, we're still suffering. Most recently, we were at the Standing Rock Reservation during the No DAPL movement, which is still taking place right now, and they're still fighting that, and it's still possible to shut down DAPL. We needed environmental assessments that hasn't been done. The very first part of that DAPL one is that when they were going to go across the Missouri River, it was up there in Bismarck, which is a white community. So they moved the pipeline down to the reservation, environmental racism. You know, and they put it down on the Standing Rock Reservation. LaDonna Allard Braypool, rest in peace, with others started a movement to fight this. Water protectors, she called us. Invited us to come up there. My daughter and I went up there. We spent the coldest winter in 100 years defending the water. Hundreds of people got arrested. We have a sister who was targeted by one of her own, our own. A young man from another tribe came in there as an infiltrator. He lied to her. He made her fall in love with him. Then he planted a gun on her. Then she spent 3-4 years in prison. We are still suffering. And our own people, their minds get warped in thinking that they're doing the right thing somehow. How can this man think that it was right to go make a woman love him and then to do that to her? That's no man. That is what the environmental racism, the genocide has done to us. Corrupted our minds. But one thing we do have, the resilience, that is that they're very few. They're very few. If you have 100 indigenous people, you're going to have 98 indigenous people. And you're going to have about 3 people out there who don't know who they are. They're going to look like us. They might even speak our languages, but they lost it in their heart. That's because of the genocide that has happened and the racism I've heard it called Amsterdam syndrome or something like that. And we're fighting those things right now. You know, they're getting the money, the capitalism. That's part of it also. So what we got to do is return to sharing, taking care of one another. Some people call it communism, but I don't know that. We were given original instructions, and those instructions said, take care of the children, feed them first. Take care of the women, you know, provide for them, home, fire. Honor the elders. They have so much wisdom, you know. And for us that are the adults, you know, not to be afraid, not to be afraid. Don't be afraid of today or tomorrow, you know. We have that traditional knowledge. And part of that traditional knowledge says, you know, when you wake up in the morning, say thank you, please and thank you. Same thing at night, say please and thank you, you know. Look to a higher power. We believe in a God, one God. We understand the nature of things. We're trying to get the rights of nature to happen, where nature has rights also. Just like that man who took hippopotamuses down to South America, now they're saying that they have human rights, you know. Why don't the indigenous people have human rights too? You know. This land, this Turtle Island, it's enough for everybody that's here right now. We have the resources, we have the knowledge to grow the food. We don't have to have the fossil fuels. We were doing fine for thousands and thousands of years without it. We're coming to a place where, a crossroads, where we have to decide as human beings, what do we want? What are we going to do from this day forward? How are we going to live? Are we going to live like this, where we're going to fight at each other? How do we come to a place of peace and love? My daughter and I, we had a difficult morning this morning. Because of the things I've heard here the last 48 hours. I sat over here and I cried. And then this morning, I was angry. I was so angry. And I'm sorry that it overflowed onto my family, my daughter. She doesn't deserve any anger from me. But again, how do I face people coming up to me and like this? I mean, every day somebody comes up to me and says, "Are you an Indian?" I said when I went outside and I said, everything I say up here in this chair today, I'm just say the truth. That's the truth. Practically every day, somebody's coming up to me and saying, "Are you an Indian person? What are you?" Mostly that's how it comes out. What are you? I said it yesterday. I'm a survivor of attempted genocide. My Omaha people got taken down to 700 individuals. 700 of us. It's 200 years to come back to about 10,000 of us now. We're proud people. We believe we have a communication with God, just like anybody else, everybody who came here. The stories that was told to the people who were here about why they were leaving their lands and coming, and we said, our hearts went out to you. We got the land, we got the water, we got the resources. We can live together if you want to, but there are rules here. Respect your mother, respect your father. But for some reason, our religion, our spirituality, our God was outlawed. I'm an original person. I believe in the original instructions. I believe in these original instructions that what we call Wakanda. Marvel Comics took and made a cartoon. Wakanda means God to us. God is Wakanda. It's not a comic book character. That is genocide. And it hurts my heart that my Black relatives embraced it.
Mr. Phillips, thank you for your courage here today. We tender the photograph from Washington, D.C.
Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I'm gonna call Eileen up so she will give us our lunch marching orders. Eileen Weitzman, thanks so much.
Yes, so the moment you've been waiting for is that lunch is here downstairs, and we're going to set up tables in the back, so feel free to come back up here and eat up here. Thanks. See you in 45 minutes or an hour. We'll see how that works out.
Thank you so very much. We have returned now from our lunch break, and we are going to continue the last witness in the count 4 of environmental racism, and then we will go right into our last count, count 5, with respect to public health. We are going to right now hear a pre-recorded testimony of Nayyirah Shariff, who is from Flint, Michigan, who is going to talk about the situation that has been going on there with respect to environmental racism issues. And her testimony will be directed by attorney Mark Fancher from Detroit. Thank you.
My name is Mark Fancher. I'm the staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project of the ACLU of Michigan. I'm also a member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. We're going to hear from this witness, Nayyirah Shariff. And Ms. Shariff, if you could state your name for the record, please.
My name is Nayyirah Shariff.
And the municipality of your residence.
I live in Flint, Michigan.
And how long have you resided there?
I lived here for 20 years.
Now, Ms. Shariff, are you aware of what has come to be known as the Flint water crisis?
Yes, I am intimately aware of it because I was one of the activists and organizers that fought to daylight that issue.
If you could, please describe for us what the problem was there, the nature of it, and the extent of it.
Well, we can't talk about the Flint water crisis unless we talk about the theft of democracy in Flint, Michigan, because Flint, the city of Flint, was under state receivership under Michigan's emergency manager law. And Michigan's emergency manager law was a law that, I would even dare to say, is a way to I would say a different way to take away people's voting rights, because this was a law that once you went into state receivership, the emergency manager replaced 2 branches of your local government. That was the legislative and the executive branch, and they automatically zeroed out the salaries of those representatives. And then also they had the power to renegotiate union contracts, sell off public assets, and then the emergency managers could apply for bankruptcy proceedings. And the Flint water crisis happened because it was an action of the emergency manager.
If I can summarize correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, the emergency manager law essentially placed the power within the hands of the governor to place all municipal power, administrative and legislative, in the hands of a single individual handpicked by the governor. And this person had the authority under this law to relieve the legislative body and the mayor of their power and to exercise all power. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it was implemented, 50% of the African-American population within the state of Michigan was under state receivership, and 75% of the African-American local elected officials had their powers usurped by an emergency manager.
And the purported reason for appointing an emergency manager, if I'm correct, is fiscal distress, financial problems within a municipality or a school district. Is that correct?
That is correct. But I also wanted to raise that the motivations for the justifications, the continued justifications of the emergency manager was using the same racist tropes that that existed since Reconstruction, because I was also one of the activists that was fighting and challenging that law and worked to get the referendum on the ballot. And I remember like some of the narratives was like, well, these communities, because Michigan, like many other communities across the country, is very racially segregated. We have a lot of racial segregation within the state. And so Detroit is like a euphemism for Black people because it is the blackest city in the country, and the city of Flint. And they were only implemented for the most part in majority Black cities. And it was like, well, these communities don't know how to handle their money. And I remember looking up, like some of the political caricatures from like the late 1800s, from the 1870s and 1880s. And it was the same type of stuff, or like using like this law to infantilize Black communities and some of the same patriarchal narratives that justifies the enslavement of Black people in this country.
Now, what specifically did the emergency manager for Flint do to cause the problem with the water? And what was the problem with the water?
Well, the emergency manager, for a city that had debt, the emergency manager drove us even deeper into debt. So the emergency manager made the decision to move us off of the Detroit water and sewer system, which we were on for over 50 years. And then also put us up for $100 million bond to build a redundant system, the Carigati Water Authority. And in the interim, the emergency manager made the decision to draw from the Flint River, even when they knew that we didn't have the equipment to draw from the Flint River. And the emergency manager also, through additional executive orders, forced a lot of people into retirement, and we did not have even the staff at the water department to monitor that switch. And the emergency manager did not even treat the water. So we were drinking raw, untreated water that poisoned a population of 100,000 people that we have to deal with the repercussions of that for generations.
What was the supposed reason for making this change in the water supply?
Well, I mean, I suspect that part of the reason was to drive Detroit into bankruptcy, because the fact that the city of Flint, which was the Detroit Water and Sewer Department's largest customer, that was used in the Detroit's bankruptcy application that the emergency manager filed, because both communities at the time were under an emergency manager.
So based on all that you saw, what were some of the practical effects of this poisoning of the water supply?
Well, I mean, I lived in Flint at the time, and I have like long-term health consequences as a result of drinking this tainted water. I now have seizures and I am unable to drive. My asthma has gotten worse. I had mild asthma, and now I have severe asthma, and so now I have to take a oral steroid, and I have to take anti-seizure medications. And, like I have to take a lot of pills that I didn't have to take, before the water crisis. And I would just say, like, for our community, like we've seen reading test scores plummet from the exposure of drinking Flint water. And this is something that is going to have impact on our community for multiple generations.
How convinced are you that all of this was deliberate, that it was done on purpose?
I mean, I'm very convinced because like all of the others, so like Flint is like the blackest community in Genesee County, and the rest originally like we were all under Detroit water. And after the switch to the Flint River, only Flint was on the Detroit water. With all of the white communities, they stayed on the Detroit water until they built like this pipeline. And the reason why, the justification that the emergency manager gave was like, it's just finances. And the crazy part is like, Flint is the birthplace of General Motors, and we do have a General Motors plant in Flint. And General Motors was able to get clean water so they can like continue to manufacture parts because their parts were rusting on Flint water. And the emergency manager hurried up and made sure that they had access to clean drinking water. And we asked why, if this is happening to parts, automobile parts, what is it doing to our bodies? And the emergency manager said, that's apples and oranges.
So if I understand your testimony, they observed the destruction of metal auto parts by the water that they purposely put into the system for Flint residents to drink. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And from what you were able to observe, were there deaths as a result of all of this?
Yes, because one of the other things that happened is there was a proliferation of different types of bacteria. So we had Legionella bacteria, we had at least 22. And the reason why I say at least 22 was because they weren't testing for it. Like a lot of these things, you have to test for it for you to find it. And they weren't testing for it. They were more interested in covering stuff up and protecting their own jobs than to center the health and well-being of a whole community.
And so I guess it stands to reason that as a result of all of this, for those who survived it, there was widespread serious bodily and mental harm.
Yeah, because for the most part, I mean, I was one of the activists and one of the organizers, but for the most part, people were just living their lives and taking care of their families. And then dealing with the mental trauma once it came out that I poisoned my kids, like that's a whole lot, like there were women who was sobbing in tears because we were collecting stories after this, all came out. And it was women who were sobbing. Like I used tap water for my formula for my baby, and I poisoned my kids.
Ms. Shariff, I want to thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Nayyirah Shariff made reference in her testimony to the emergency manager law in Michigan. It was a notorious and devious method to disempower communities that were predominantly communities of color. In many ways, it was a badge or incident of slavery that should have been prohibited under the 13th Amendment. If we understand the early years of this country, how enslaved African people were used as political placeholders. At the time of the framing of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2 included a provision whereby enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for political processes, not for purposes of their participation in the process, but to ensure that Southern planters who lived in a region sparsely populated by white residents could ensure for themselves that they would fare on an equivalent or equitable basis with people from other parts of the country with respect to apportionment in Congress. The enslaved people were not included as participants in this process, but as political placeholders to ensure the power of those who purportedly owned them. When we look at the emergency manager law, we see something that's very comparable. A governor who wants to exercise full power at the local level appoints an individual who goes in and makes decisions and takes all of the power away from those who have been democratically elected in local elections, and then imposes his or her will through the emergency manager law. And we see the destructive consequences in Flint. In this case, as in the days of the period of enslavement, Black people within these communities were political placeholders. Yes, they were able to go to the ballot box. Yes, they were able to cast votes, but these votes were essentially meaningless because the people that they elected had no power because of the emergency manager law. As in the days of the period of enslavement, when people resisted and they fought and they rebelled against that unlawful, unjust, immoral system, people within the state of Michigan also revolted, particularly in Detroit and in cities like Flint. There was a referendum that was placed on the ballot challenging the validity, the constitutionality of the emergency manager law. Barriers were erected to having it placed on the ballot, including such petty practices by officials of claiming that the petitions that were circulated did not use the proper font. A court battle was necessary all the way up to the state Supreme Court in order to ensure that this was placed on the ballot. And once it was on the ballot, grassroots organizing went into effect, particularly in the city of Detroit. People were mobilized. People came out and they did everything that they needed to do in order to ensure that this law was stricken from the books. On the evening of the election, while largely white regions in the state of Michigan voted to retain the emergency manager law, it was Black people, African descended people who came out in mass numbers to overwhelm them and to succeed in having this particular legislation wiped from the books. Within several days, law firms that were backing the emergency manager law and serving as counsel to the governor and to others went to the state legislature with a new piece of legislation. It was the identical emergency manager law, but this time it included an appropriations provision, which under Michigan law meant that it was not subject to referendum. It was bulletproof. The same method, the same strategy that had been used to eliminate that law by the masses of people could no longer be used. This is the level of devious, cunning, immoral, unconscionable conduct, which has led to the types of crises that we've seen in the state of Michigan, and specifically with respect to the Flint water crisis, as you've just heard. The more things change, the more things stay the same. And it points out to us that the need to remain vigilant and to remain constant in our struggles against the forces of oppression are there for us at all times.
Thank you so very much. We have returned now from our lunch break, and we are going to continue the last witness in the count 4 of environmental racism, and then we will go right into our last count, count 5, with respect to public health. We are going to right now hear a pre-recorded testimony of Nayyirah Shariff, who is from Flint, Michigan, who is going to talk about the situation that has been going on there with respect to environmental racism issues. And her testimony will be directed by attorney Mark Fancher from Detroit. Thank you.
My name is Mark Fancher. I'm the staff attorney for the Racial Justice Project of the ACLU of Michigan. I'm also a member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. We're going to hear from this witness, Nayyirah Shariff. And Ms. Shariff, if you could state your name for the record, please.
My name is Nayyirah Shariff.
And the municipality of your residence.
I live in Flint, Michigan.
And how long have you resided there?
I lived here for 20 years.
Now, Ms. Shariff, are you aware of what has come to be known as the Flint water crisis?
Yes, I am intimately aware of it because I was one of the activists and organizers that fought to daylight that issue.
If you could, please describe for us what the problem was there, the nature of it, and the extent of it.
Well, we can't talk about the Flint water crisis unless we talk about the theft of democracy in Flint, Michigan, because Flint, the city of Flint, was under state receivership under Michigan's emergency manager law. And Michigan's emergency manager law was a law that, I would even dare to say, is a way to I would say a different way to take away people's voting rights, because this was a law that once you went into state receivership, the emergency manager replaced two branches of your local government. That was the legislative and the executive branch, and they automatically zeroed out the salaries of those representatives. And then also they had the power to renegotiate union contracts, sell off public assets, and then the emergency managers could apply for bankruptcy proceedings. And the Flint water crisis happened because it was an action of the emergency manager.
If I can summarize correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, the emergency manager law essentially placed the power within the hands of the governor to place all municipal power, administrative and legislative, in the hands of a single individual handpicked by the governor. And this person had the authority under this law to relieve the legislative body and the mayor of their power and to exercise all power. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it was implemented. 50% of the African American population within the state of Michigan was under state receivership, and 75% of the African American local elected officials had their powers usurped by an emergency manager.
And the purported reason for appointing an emergency manager, if I'm correct, is fiscal distress, financial problems within a municipality or a school district. Is that correct?
That is correct. But I also wanted to raise that the motivations for the justifications, the continued justifications of the emergency manager was using the same racist tropes that existed since Reconstruction, because I was also one of the activists that was fighting and challenging that law and worked to get the referendum on the ballot. And I remember some of the narratives was well, these communities, because Michigan, like many other communities across the country, is very racially segregated. We have a lot of racial segregation within the state. And so Detroit is like a euphemism for Black people because it is the blackest city in the country and the city of Flint. And they were only implemented for the most part in majority Black cities. And it was like, well, these communities don't know how to handle their money. And I remember looking up, like some of the political caricatures from like the late 1800s, from the 1870s and 1880s. And it was the same type of stuff, or like using like this law to infantilize Black communities and some of the same patriarchal narratives that justifies the enslavement of Black people in this country.
Now, what specifically did the emergency manager for Flint do to cause the problem with the water? And what was the problem with the water?
Well, the emergency manager, for a city that had debt, the emergency manager drove us even deeper into debt. So the emergency manager made the decision to move us off of the Detroit water and sewer system, which we were on for over 50 years. And then also put us up for $100 million bond to build a redundant system, the Karagadi Water Authority. And in the interim, the emergency manager made the decision to draw from the Flint River, even when they knew that we didn't have the equipment to draw from the Flint River. And the emergency manager also, through additional executive orders, forced a lot of people into retirement and we did not have even the staff at the water department to monitor that switch. And the emergency manager did not even treat the water. So we were drinking raw, untreated water that poisoned a population of 100,000 people that we have to deal with the repercussions of that for generations.
What was the supposed reason for making this change in the water supply?
Well, I mean, I suspect that part of the reason was to drive Detroit into bankruptcy because the fact that the city of Flint, which was the Detroit Water and Sewer Department's largest customer, that was used in the Detroit's bankruptcy application that the emergency manager filed, because both communities at the time were under an emergency manager.
So based on all that you saw, what were some of the practical effects of this poisoning of the water supply?
Well, I mean, I lived in Flint at the time, and I have like long-term health consequences as a result of drinking this tainted water. I now have seizures and I am unable to drive. My asthma has gotten worse. I had mild asthma and now I have severe asthma. And so now I have to take a oral steroid and I have to take anti-seizure medications. And, I have to take a lot of pills that I didn't have to take, before the water crisis. And I would just say, for our community, we've seen reading test scores plummet from the exposure of drinking Flint water. And this is something that is going to have impact on our community for multiple generations.
How convinced are you that all of this was deliberate, that it was done on purpose?
I mean, I'm very convinced because all of the others, so Flint is the blackest community in Genesee County, and the rest originally we were all under Detroit water. And after the switch to the Flint River, only Flint was on the Detroit water. With all of the white communities, they stayed on the Detroit water until they built this pipeline. And the reason why, the justification that the emergency manager gave was it's just finances. And the crazy part is Flint is the birthplace of General Motors, and we do have a General Motors plant in Flint. And General Motors was able to get clean water so they can continue to manufacture parts. because their parts were rusting on Flint water. And the emergency manager hurried up and made sure that they had access to clean drinking water. And we asked why, if this is happening to parts, automobile parts, what is it doing to our bodies? And the emergency manager said, that's apples and oranges.
So if I understand your testimony, they observed the destruction of metal auto parts by the water that they purposely put into the system for Flint residents to drink. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And from what you were able to observe, were there deaths as a result of all of this?
Yes, because one of the other things that happened is there was a proliferation of different types of bacteria. So we had Legionella bacteria, we had at least 22. And the reason why I say at least 22 was because they weren't testing for it. Like a lot of these things, you have to test for it for you to find it. And they weren't testing for it. They were more interested in covering stuff up and protecting their own jobs than to center the health and well-being of a whole community.
And so I guess it stands to reason that as a result of all of this, for those who survived it, there was widespread serious bodily and mental harm.
Yeah, because for the most part, I mean, I was one of the activists and one of the organizers, but for the most part, people were just living their lives and taking care of their families. And then dealing with the mental trauma once it came out that I poisoned my kids, like that's a whole lot, you know? Like there were women who was sobbing and in tears because we were collecting stories after this, you know, all came out. And it was women who were sobbing. Like I used tap water for my formula for my baby, and I poisoned my kids.
Ms. Shariff, I want to thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Nayyirah Shariff made reference in her testimony to the emergency manager law in Michigan. It was a notorious and devious method to disempower communities that were predominantly communities of color. In many ways, it was a badge or incident of slavery that should have been prohibited under the 13th Amendment. If we understand the early years of this country, how enslaved African people were used as political placeholders. At the time of the framing of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2 included a provision whereby enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for political processes, not for purposes of their participation in the process, but to ensure that Southern planters who lived in a region sparsely populated by white residents could ensure for themselves that they would fare on an equivalent or equitable basis with people from other parts of the country with respect to apportionment in Congress. The enslaved people were not included as participants in this process, but as political placeholders to ensure the power of those who purportedly owned them. When we look at the emergency manager law, we see something that's very comparable. A governor who wants to exercise full power at the local level appoints an individual who goes in and makes decisions and takes all of the power away from those who have been democratically elected in local elections, and then imposes his or her will through the emergency manager law. And we see the destructive consequences in Flint. In this case, as in the days of the period of enslavement, Black people within these communities were political placeholders. Yes, they were able to go to the ballot box. Yes, they were able to cast votes, but these votes were essentially meaningless because the people that they elected had no power because of the emergency manager law. As in the days of the period of enslavement, when people resisted and they fought and they rebelled against that unlawful, unjust, immoral system, people within the state of Michigan also revolted, particularly in Detroit and in cities like Flint. There was a referendum that was placed on the ballot challenging the validity, the constitutionality of the emergency manager law. Barriers were erected to having it placed on the ballot, including such petty practices by officials of claiming that the petitions that were circulated did not use the proper font. A court battle was necessary all the way up to the state Supreme Court in order to ensure that this was placed on the ballot. And once it was on the ballot, grassroots organizing went into effect, particularly in the city of Detroit. People were mobilized. People came out and they did everything that they needed to do in order to ensure that this law was stricken from the books. On the evening of the election, while largely white regions in the state of Michigan voted to retain the emergency manager law, it was Black people, African descended people who came out in mass numbers to overwhelm them and to succeed in having this particular legislation wiped from the books. Within several days, law firms that were backing the emergency manager law and serving as counsel to the governor and to others went to the state legislature with a new piece of legislation. It was the identical emergency manager law, but this time it included an appropriations provision, which under Michigan law meant that it was not subject to referendum. It was bulletproof. The same method, the same strategy that had been used to eliminate that law by the masses of people could no longer be used. This is the level of devious, cunning, immoral, unconscionable conduct, which has led to the types of crises that we've seen in the state of Michigan, and specifically with respect to the Flint water crisis, as you've just heard. The more things change, the more things stay the same. And it points out to us that the need to remain vigilant and to remain constant in our struggles against the forces of oppression are there for us at all times.